Gather round the campfire, friends. I have a chilling tale to tell you. A story of a ruthless killer who prowled the streets of Seattle, preying on vulnerable women who had no one to protect them, no one who cared if they just disappeared. Our first victim, 16-year-old Wendy, came from a broken home. In and out of foster care her whole life, she finally gave up and left to live on the streets. With no family to look out for her, she sold her body just to survive. Just a scared little girl trying to make it to 17. Wendy disappeared into the dark Seattle night, and a week later, her fragile body was found near the Green River. The police who discovered Wendy's body just shook their heads, assuming she was just another runaway teen who met with foul play. They didn't know then that her death was only the beginning. The first move made by a ruthless killer who would end up taking at least 49 lives in what would become the longest and most notorious criminal case in Washington state's history. Wendy's case lingers unsolved for nearly a month, until more bodies start mysteriously surfacing. 4 weeks after Wendy's demise, a young woman, 23-year-old Deborah, bobs to the surface of the river, face down in the murky water, dress tangled around her legs. Then, just 3 days later, 2 more bodies appear. 31-year-old Marcia and 17-year-old Cynthia, weighted down by heavy boulders, badly decomposed. And as police process the scene, divers find yet another body, 16-year-old Opal. The victim count is rising. It's now clear to police that something sinister is stirring in Seattle. Young women disappearing at an alarming rate, only to resurface days later in the river. The Green River Killer has established his dumping ground, but the slaughter has only just begun. By the end of 1983, 13 victims have been fished from the river, the bodies piling up with no suspect in sight. All women working the streets, selling themselves to survive, or teenage runaways with no one to come looking. Surely someone with such little regard for human life must have left clues. Evidence that would lead police right to his door? Well, this mystery spans over decades for good reason, my friends. The Green River Killer was a master manipulator, evading capture by police twice. But let's start at the beginning. Young Gary Ridgway, the man who would be known as the Green River Killer, grew up in the 1980s before people understood criminal profiling like they do today. And his home life gave no obvious clues that he would grow into a merciless serial killer. Neighbors thought the Ridgways seemed like the perfect family. But behind closed doors, darkness stirred inside Gary from a young age. While Gary appeared normal on the outside, behind closed doors, his mother did things no parent should. She was controlling and abusive, physically and emotionally, speaking to him in sexually disturbing ways no mother should. Gary's father worked at a mortuary, also exposing the boy to things no child should hear. Tales of violations done to the dead. These influences twisted young Gary's psyche, blending pain with pleasure and breeding anger towards women. Outwardly, Gary grew into an awkward and mediocre man, but inside lurked a predator. He joined the Navy as a young adult, where his simmering rage towards women grew. After contracting an STD overseas, he blamed the female sex worker for ruining his life instead of taking personal responsibility. So his hatred focused sharply on those selling their bodies to survive. Gary eventually married and divorced twice, his anger and violent tendencies intensifying with each failed relationship. His second wife feared him, could see the brewing storm beneath the surface of this quiet man, but never imagined what he would become. The Green River killings began sometime in the early 1980s after his second divorce. When 16-year-old Wendy turned up along the Green River in July 1982, no one made the connection. Not when more women began disappearing at alarming rates, and not after Gary's name first landed on detectives' radar. A witness had spotted victim number 23, young Marie, climbing willingly into Gary's truck shortly before vanishing, and saw that same truck soon after, parked at Gary's home. Now finally, a solid lead. Gary evaded capture twice. Here is strike one. When questioned, Gary appeared cooperative, just a normal guy who passes polygraphs with flying colors because he feels no remorse. Without evidence from Marie's missing person case, the police had to let him go. Though he remained on their radar, the bodies continued piling up. So many that after 36 victims, a special Green River task force was formed to pursue this prolific serial killer plaguing their community. By 1984, Gary had claimed at least 44 lives, and the violence would have continued unchecked if not for a sudden lull in killings that year. The savagery paused briefly when Gary remarried again. In any case, the task force keeps hunting as the deaths temporarily subside. They even circulate a composite sketch of the killer, generated from eyewitnesses. Imagine Gary's secret delight seeing his own face in the newspapers next to the word killer, imagining himself outwitting the cops as he plays the part of the normal family man. The violence resumed, of course. Another 15 poor souls vanished before 1987, when detectives circle back to Gary once again. One glimpse of him with a victim in his truck wasn't enough, but more eyewitness leads point his way. His alibis fail to check out, and police start tracking his mileage versus gas purchased, realizing this man travels many more miles than his boring day job can account for. So the Green River Task Force hauls Gary in again 7 years after Wendy's death, after 63 murders attributed to their suspect. Surely this time they've got him. This brings us to strike two. With no evidence to hold him, the police again have to let Gary slither away despite their suspicions, and the killings immediately resume. 6 more lives claimed in less than a year after Gary flees their grasp. Gary was smug with delight, cocky enough now to start planting fake evidence and muddying the investigative waters. He knew they were trying hard to pin the crimes on him, but the Green River Killer doesn't think he'll ever get caught. Until 2001 rolls around, and DNA science has advanced enough to conclusively tie Gary Ridgway to several victims. Hair and fluid samples collected from crime scenes decades old. Finally enough to arrest him. A killer captured after nearly 20 years tormenting the Seattle community. The infamous Green River Killer now had a face and name. Gary Ridgway, the unassuming man who brought pure evil to the Seattle streets for over 20 years. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Gary escaped the death penalty by providing detailed confessions. He admitted to murdering at least 49 women over his infamous 20-year killing spree, though he may be responsible for as many as 90. He led authorities to undiscovered remains around Seattle, which provided closure to some grieving families. In return, prosecutors took capital punishment off the table. Gary received 48 life sentences with no possibility of parole. He now spends his days in a tiny cell at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. Images of the silver-haired 71-year-old pacing his small concrete space sometimes make the news to this day. America's most notorious serial killer still very much alive, paying a price for his crimes, but so many questions remaining unanswered, the full truth perhaps locked inside Ridgway's troubled mind forever.